Hello and welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. In this video exclusively for my Patreon subscribers, I wish to discuss with you Darwin's theory of evolution, along with some other comments here as well. So, a little brief background on Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was born, I think he and Abe Lincoln have the same birthday. I think it was February 12th, 1809. He went on the voyage of the Beagle. It was a 5-year voyage. It was in the 1830s. And during the course of this voyage, he collected many specimens. He took copious notes, wrote extensively in his diary, which then formed the basis for his later analysis for his Origin of Species. And took him 20 years to go to make this analysis, come to the conclusion that he came to, do a lot of thinking about what he saw, what the specimens indicated to him, and so forth. Well, it's interesting though, after he returned from this voyage and returned home, the rest of his life he ventured no more than 10 miles from his home. Kind of interesting. At the same time, working in basically off in Australia, Indonesia, out in that direction, Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with similar thinking about what evolution is. And basically both of these gentlemen came up with the idea of descent with modifications. So, what is the theory of evolution? And before we get into it, there are those who are anti-evolution, who say that evolution is just a theory, and when you say, well, this creature became this creature, where are the intermediary forms, where are the transitional forms? They're always putting forth these, what they think are, aha, got you, you're wrong. Well, in science, a theory is a very specific thing. It's a hypothesis that's been well substantiated, has withstood rigorous testing. It's not like a theory to a layperson, which is conjecture or just speculation that really have no basis in observations. Evolution is fact. We have evidence from paleontology, from geology, from genetics, developmental biology, comparative anatomy. We have the evidence that substantiates this. The theory of evolution is not evolution took place. Evolution takes place is established fact. To say otherwise is, well, you're just living in, I don't know, off in La La Land probably. What the theory of evolution is, or evolutionary theory, is what is the mechanism by which the process of evolution takes place. The analogy, a good analog, would be gravity. We know gravity exists. Gravity allows celestial objects to coalesce. It allows us to not be flung off the surface of this celestial object. We know gravity exists. Gravitational theory tries to explain what gravity is. Einstein, with his relativity, basically describes gravity as a warping of the space-time continuum. Okay? We're testing that. We're now seeing what? Gravity waves. Gravity waves are being detected and confirmed. This is cool stuff. So, the theory of evolution is the mechanism by which evolution takes place. Evolution is established fact. It does take place. Organisms change over time. That's all evolution. That's what evolution is about. Organisms change over time. So, there are two main points to evolution. All life on Earth is connected and related to each other. In an earlier video, you heard me talk about how viral DNA may be responsible for our consciousness. The fact that we even have viral DNA as part of our genome is further evidence of all life being interrelated. The fact that we share 98% to 99% of the DNA material with chimpanzees. We're related. The fact that you can, see the similar genes in organisms going way back, we're all related. So that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect, diversity of life is a product of modifications of populations by natural selection. Some traits are favored in over others. Okay? That's the idea behind the descent with modifications that Darwin put forth. Now, the theory is sometimes described as survival of the fittest, and that's a bit misleading. Fittest doesn't necessarily mean, I'm the strongest, I'm the biggest, and I will pummel your butt into the ground. Fittest simply means you have the best traits that enable you to survive best in the environment you are located in. If I have a mastodon, or let's take a woolly mammoth. If I have a woolly mammoth, and I take that woolly mammoth and I plop it into tropical South America, it's going to die, because it is not fit to survive in that environment. Okay? So, survival of the fittest is really, in organisms, does the organism have traits, characteristics that enable it to survive in the environment it finds itself in? If a big rock comes tumbling out of the sky and boom, throws up enough ejecta into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun, killing photosynthesis, you know what? Organisms don't have time to adapt. They die. Part of the reason why climate change is a problem, because it's the rate of change that's the problem. Yes, the climate has changed in the past, but not as fast as we're doing it now. And that does not give organisms enough time to adapt. So fitness really refers to an organism's ability to survive in the environment it's found in a given environment. That's the important point there. A well-known example to show evolution, whales. And in the first edition on the Origin of Species in 1859, Darwin speculated about how natural selection could cause a land mammal to turn into a whale. As a hypothetical example, he used the North American black bears, which were known to catch insects by swimming in the water with their mouth open. And I will quote from him. "I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered, by natural selection, more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, until a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale," he speculated. Well, that particular statement, that particular idea did not go down too well. And Darwin received a lot of ridicule and was rather embarrassed by that, so that the swimming bear passage in later editions of On the Origin of Species was removed. Well, Darwin had the right idea, he just had the wrong animal. Okay? He should have been looking at some ungulate, like a cow or maybe a hippopotamus. So the origin of whales is a very fascinating evolutionary story. The last shore-dwelling ancestor of modern whales was Sononyx, kind of like a hyena-like animal. And over the course of 60 million years, several transitional forms evolved. We have Indohyus, who was the first one after the terrestrial form. Ambulocetus, more on Ambulocetus later, it's a personal favorite of mine. Rhodocetus, Basilosaurus, Dorodon, and finally modern humpback whale. Anyway, or any whale, but they... So, now if you look at Ambulocetus, okay, ambulatory, meaning walking. Cetus, well, whales are collectively called cetaceans. Cetus refers to whales. So we have walking whale. Well, the scientific name, that's the genus name, the species name is natans. So Ambulocetus natans. Natans refers to swimming. So literally it translates as walking, swimming whale. I said I will have more on that creature later. So natural selection can change species in small ways, causing a population to change color or size over the course of several generations. So any subtle changes, it could even be changes in the physiology. Say, for example, how, if I have an herbivore that eats a plant over here, and the plant develops, well, the plant doesn't like being chewed upon, so it develops chemicals. The herbivore ingests the plant with those chemicals. The chemical gives the herbivores a bellyache, and it's like, oh, okay. And so the herbivore improves its physiology to deal with that chemical, so it doesn't get any more belly aches, so it can continue eating that plant. The plant then realizes, hey, that didn't work. It then develops further chemicals to give the herbivore more belly aches, and so on. So you can have changes like that, subtle changes, in this case physiology, both herbivore and plant. That's microevolution. Okay? Natural selection is capable of much more. Given enough time and enough accumulated changes, natural selection can create entirely new species. Macroevolution. That's called a macroevolution. Macroevolution is essentially speciation, the formation of new species. Now, what is natural selection? As organisms have traits. If the traits prove favorable to the organism to enable it to survive in the environment it is found in, it will be selected for. If the traits are unfavorable, it will be selected out. Okay, so random genetic changes. And this is a key point that a lot of anti-evolutionary people get wrong, or they don't understand. Random genetic changes resulted in at least one whale having its nostrils placed farther back on its head. Enables it to breathe easier. Those animals with this adaptation would have been better suited to marine situation, environment, since they would not have to completely surface to breathe. Look at modern whales today. They come up, the top of the head barely breaks the surface, the nostrils quickly open and close, and they quickly exhale and inhale within a fraction of a second. And it goes back under the water, what have you. Such animals would have been more successful and have more offspring. Later generations, more genetic changes occurred, moving the nose or the nostrils further back on the head. Okay? Now, I would actually call that a case of microevolution. Other body parts of early whales also changed. Front legs became flippers, back legs disappeared. If you look in a whale and a skeleton, you will see the pelvic girdle there. There's just extremely vestigial bones. Okay? Now, that process of front legs becoming flippers back, okay, that will result in different looking form, different speciation. And then they later developed the flukes, horizontal tail flukes that allow for a better propulsion through the water. Darwin also described the form of natural selection that depends on an organism's success at attracting a mate, a process known as sexual selection. Colorful plumage of birds, peacocks for example, okay? The antlers of a moose, the antlers of a mule deer, you get the idea. Okay? Now, this gentleman gets a lot of ridicule. But when you really think about what Lamarck said, he kind of had a right idea, it's just that his mechanism was not correct. And what did he come up with? Lamarck came up with the idea of organisms passing on traits. But his traits that were passed on were not those that were inherited, but were those that were acquired. For example, an animal keeps stretching its neck to reach leaves on a higher location. The neck becomes elongated. Oh, we have a giraffe eventually. So he was right in the idea of traits being passed on, but his mechanism was not correct. So let's not always ridicule Lamarck. He made important contributions. And I mentioned earlier, Alfred Russel Wallace independently came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. So, what goes on here? Darwin himself, in his book, he admitted that there were missing forms, that he did not have complete fossil record. He admitted that some of his speculations, some of his analysis might be incorrect. He was fully aware of that. He was unaware of genetics. I mean, Gregor Mendel was still, 20 years out, looking at peas. And Gregor Mendel lucked out that he chose peas, because peas have a very, straightforward recessive dominant traits and that kind of stuff. Darwin did not know about genetics. So because he did not know about genetics, he could not really put forth a mechanism. Okay. We now know how genes encode and stuff like that. So, as I mentioned earlier, evolutionary theory is the mechanism by which evolution takes place. We have evidence from paleontology, geology, and so forth. Now we have a better understanding of genetics. And Dr. Sean B. Carroll, University of Wisconsin-Madison, has basically developed, he's a geneticist, and he's developed a field of biology called evolutionary developmental biology. It's a mouthful. We call it short Evo-Devo. But the crux of his work is as follows. All organisms, and this goes back to the point of all organisms being related, all organisms, be it a humpback whale, a sequoia tree, a fungus, a rattlesnake, a perch, a human, all organisms, when you look at the genetic genome, they all have the same, what he calls, toolbox kit of genes. A genetic toolbox kit. And what does this toolbox kit of genes do? It contains the instructions of how to build the organism. Yes, you tweak this here and you tweak that there, and you get your different, sequoia and humpback whales and so on. But all organisms have the same toolbox kit of genes. And these genes code for the structure of the animal, but they're all the same. I think he calls them Hoc genes, H-O-C, if I recall correctly. He wrote a book, I think it's called Wondrous Forms. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it. And as an example, not only do the genes tell how to build the organism, what structures to add, also tells you what structures to remove. For example, here are my fingers. Well, at some point in the development, as I was gestating, there was skin, there was membranes in between. A gene then comes in, clicks on this, and says to the cells here, time to die. And they die, and then that material is removed, leaving distinct fingers. There are some people that are born with webbed fingers because that gene did not activate, did not tell those cells time to die. In my view, Dr. Carroll's Evo-Devo work is pretty much as close to a unifying theory of evolution as I think there is, because it's really helping to explain the mechanism and how all these different creatures and species can occur. So, it's also important to remember that genes encode not just the physical appearance of the organism, but also codes for the physiological processes that go on within the organism. How many times have you heard of, well, someone is, has this, like Tay-Sachs disease, which is fatal, right? That's a genetic that affects the physiology. You have Klinefelter. You have a lot of, diseases that affect the physiology. Okay? So genes encode our physical appearance, our physiological processes, our behavioral traits. Why are some people moody and others more gregarious? Probably down to our genes. Okay. So the incorporation of genetics in Darwin's theory is modern evolutionary synthesis, and to me the topper of that is Dr. Carroll's work in Evo Devo. So, what's that mechanism now? The mechanism, the basis for which is mutations. Mutations can be caused by random changes in the DNA sequencing, the codon, the triplet bases, if you will. Okay? Or even if any genetic repairs that have taken place. Sometimes mutations can be caused by environmental factors. Carcinogens, agents that cause cancer. A mutation in a cell, you have cancer. Typically harmful. Okay? What the anti-evolutionary people get wrong is they say, well, if mutations are random, then you can't have evolution because everything is random. And that's where they're wrong. Yes, mutations are random. How the mutations are acted upon is not random. If a mutation confers a favorable trait, gives an advantage to an organism to survive, that mutation will be selected for. If a mutation does not confer a favorable aspect, or perhaps is detrimental, it is selected against, it is removed. Yes, most mutations are harmful, but not all. Again, let me repeat, this is an important point. Mutations are random. How they are acted upon is not random. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, and I think he revisits this in the Climbing Mount Improbable as well. In the book, he describes how an eyeball can form. He discusses the evolution of the eye. Because people say, it's too complicated a structure to have evolved by natural selection. Well, you can start out with a layer of cells. The layers, and then you can start out with that layer of cells is found lining a pit. And that layer of cells forms photoreceptors that's sensitive to light levels. And then eventually you can have another layer of cells that forms a lens. And so on and so forth until you have a fully structured eye as we know today. And we see eye spots in planaria. Basically, they can detect light levels. And then we have what? We have the vertebrate eye. We have the cephalopod eye, which is probably the most complex eye in all of the animal kingdom. The cephalopod eye does not have a blind spot like the vertebrate eye does. Then you have the insect eye. So the fact that you have different types of eyes evolving independently is evidence that it's not as crazy a structure to form as one would think. So, when the story of the whales was being first considered, they didn't necessarily have the intermediary or the transitional forms. And creationists basically say, you're wrong. See, you're all wrong there. And that all changed in 1994 with the discovery of Ambulocetus natans. Okay, and I already told you what that means, swimming, walking whale. Walking, swimming whale, whatever. Okay, but that's what its name literally translates as. Its forelimbs had fingers and small hooves, but its hind feet were enormous, given its size, and the hind feet were providing a lot of propulsion. It was still able to get on land, though clumsily, sort of like a seal these days. When it swam, the ancient creature moved like an otter, right? Sinuous body motion, pushing back with its hind feet, but undulating its spine and tail. Modern whales propel themselves with the flukes. And I was in Bermuda at some point, and there was a dolphin pool, and I was at the Bermuda Biological Station down there, and the director allowed some of us to swim with the dolphins. The rule is you grab the dorsal fin, don't put your fingers anywhere near their blowhole. They won't like that. And I rode on a dolphin. Now this was about a 7-foot long critter. You can feel the power in the flukes. You move. It was quite revealing. Quite an experience. And I already described to you the more and more transitional forms that have been found. So now, going back, the creationists are still arguing Darwinism. And as we just discussed, we've moved past that. It's like still saying, oh, let's just stick with Newtonian physics when we now have Einsteinian physics. But these people don't realize that science evolved. Science, we get more and more knowledge. We learn more and more things. So, going back to the idea of natural selection and speciation. When you look at Darwin, he said, oh, you have accumulated changes over many, many, many generations. In other words, he's arguing for gradualism. Now you have to think back to what was going on in the 1800s. In the 1800s, scientists were kind of finding out like, hey, the Earth is kind of an old place. It ain't just 4,000 or 6,000 years old or whatever the Bible says. It's an old place. So, therefore, it must take a really long time to form the mountains. It must take a really, really long time to erode those mountains and bring the sediments into the sea. It must take a really, really long time for glaciers to grow and recede. So with that mindset, Darwin was also thinking it must take a really, really long time for organisms to change into other species, for speciation to occur. And for many years, there was a kind of a rivalry between Richard Dawkins, who was a staunch adherent to the Darwin point of view of gradualism, and Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldredge, with their what they call punctuated equilibrium. In the 70s, Gould and Eldredge, upon examining snails, Gould's specialty was in snails, especially the genus Syrian, I think it was. But they looked extensively at the fossil record, did a lot of statistical analyses and so forth, and they concluded that organisms exhibit long periods of stasis, punctuated by episodes of rapid speciation. The long periods of stasis is the equilibrium part of punctuated equilibrium, and the punctuated by rapid speciation is the punctuated equilibrium. So basically what they're stating is that there are long periods of where not much is happening in terms of speciation, and then boom, there's episodes of rapid speciation. So when people ask me, well, who do you think is right? Think Dawkins is right? Think Gould is right? And my answer, both. They're both right. Is it possible to have gradualism result in speciation? Of course. Is that probably what takes place? Maybe not. But there's plenty of evidence to indicate that punc-eq, as punctuated equilibrium is known as, that punc-eq is the mechanism that best explains speciation. So punc-eq probably explains macroevolution best, where gradualism, what Darwin proposed, most likely explains microevolution best. And now we have genetic evidence that backs up the punk-eek aspect for macroevolution. We now know that a slight change in the triplet, in the genetic codon base there, or in a slight change in a group of closely related genes, can result in a rapid change in form of the resulting offspring. For example, all birds contain the set of genes that, if were activated, instead of having a beak, you'd have an elongated snout with teeth and probably forelimbs instead of wings. In other words, you'd have a dinosaur. There are those who say that dinosaurs, not all dinosaurs went extinct. One group of theropod dinosaurs, the velociraptors, the T-Rex, the two-legged guys, one group of theropod dinosaurs survived. It survived the rock tumbling out of the sky at the KT, the Cretaceous boundary. And that group is called birds. Birds are, in essence, dinosaurs. Dr. Robert Bacher proposed a reclassification. If you look at the classification scheme, we start with species, which is the most precise, right down to the individual species. Then you have, next is genus, then family, then order, then class, and finally phylum. So phylum is the most broad encompassing, species is the most specific. We have class Mammalia, class Reptilia, class Amphibia, class Aves for birds. Dr. Bacher proposed that we have class Dinosauria with either subclasses or suborders, such as Ornithian, which are bird-hip-like dinosaurs, Saurischians, which are lizard-shaped hip dinosaurs, Crocodilia, and Aves. Now here's an interesting point. If you look at the pelvis of a bird, the ilium and the ischium are pointed posteriorly. If you look at the Saurian dinosaurs, the ischium is swung more forward. But here's the thing. Theropod dinosaurs were Saurischians. They had the quote-unquote lizard-shaped hip. So it goes to show you that the bird-like hip evolved twice. Evolved in the Ornithians, creatures like Stegosaurus, as well as later on birds. That's an interesting thing. So, going back to, we now know that a slight tweaking in the gene can result in a different looking form. So with that information in hand, yeah, it's very conceivable to see how you can get rapid speciation. True, geographical isolation helps with the speciation, such as in Darwin's finches on the Galapagos, and that's a situation where isolation, you can either get rapid speciation or you can get gradual speciation. When you have a genetic change that results in a different form, it's still acted upon. It's still natural selection taking place. So whether it be through gradual, slow, imperceivable changes over time, or quickly, the fact is you have a mutation, and that mutation is acted upon. It's selected for or it's selected against. Natural selection. So the idea of natural selection applies to a gradualistic approach or a punctuated equilibrium approach. It applies to both. So, I just wanted to, again, this is an exclusive video for my Patreon subscribers. There'll be more coming. In the future, I will discuss in more detail scientists like Gould and Dawkins and Ernst Mayr, Mark Norell, for example, Sean B. Carroll. I'll be talking about these gentlemen and their work. I've kind of given you a hint of Gould. Gould is a scientist I personally look up to. I have just about all his books. I think a lot of his books were based on his monthly column in Natural History magazine that was entitled "This View of Life." Where did he come up with that phrase, "this view of life"? It comes from Darwin's On the Origin of Species, last sentence. There is grandeur in this view of life that all organisms have and continue to evolve. And that's the only time that in the entire Origin of Species that Darwin ever uses the word evolve. Very last word. Bang! Nails it. So, I'll be talking about these gentlemen. I'll be talking about other aspects of evolution, and of course bringing you the latest finds from the world of paleontology, and other videos exclusively for my Patreon subscribers will deal with climate issues, where I'll discuss specific studies in great detail. For example, upcoming will be the conveyor belt discussion of that, and so on. One thing I wanted to mention about Gould. Well, actually, he wrote a book called Ontogeny. Ontogeny Recapitulates Phylogeny. And what that concept is, if you look at the developing embryo, the development of the embryo is called ontogeny. And if you look at it, you kind of say, well, that kind of looks like a fish, that kind of looks like an amphibian, that kind of looks like a chicken, and that kind of stuff there. And there was the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Phylogeny basically referring to the evolutionary history of the organism, going from its ancestors way, way back when. And the notion was that the development of the organism is reflecting its evolutionary history. That idea, while it has its merits, it's kind of fallen out of vogue in recent times, but you can understand where that came from. And I think it was Ernst Mayr who actually first described that idea. So we'll be talking about that later on. But anyway, I will end this here. I hope you found this video interesting and informative. As I said, there'll be more videos exclusively for Patreon subscribers. And I thank you for your time. I thank you for watching.